a die-hard sports fan, I was very worried about losing touch with my sports fandom because I loved rugby, cricket, soccer. So what would I get interested in when I came to the United States? I thought it might be American football because when I was growing up in the 80s, everybody in England was a Chicago Bears fan. That was just, we all got that on TV, so I thought, well, maybe I'll pick up my latent interest in football. Then I thought, well, it might be basketball. Last night was very exciting, and I used to play basketball, so I thought, well, maybe it'll be basketball that captures my attention. But no, I was surprised to learn that it was soon baseball that I got obsessed with and became a keen Padres fan. And I think baseball grabbed my imagination because it's quite similar to cricket. It's got that rhythm that I like. And so now every evening I watch the highlights of the Padres game, and I tell my wife, I give her a quick report of how the game went. She has absolutely no interest, but I tell her anyway. I like the mythology and the history and the stats of baseball and the depth to it. So I was very pleased to hear that VBS this year, which happened yesterday, had a baseball theme, which I took as an invitation to pick out some of the ways that baseball can illuminate the themes in today's reading. For example, 2 of our readings are concerned with timing, which is very important in baseball as so many other sports. Why is it that some people can hit a baseball more than 400 feet? Well, it's because, one of the main reasons, is because they have great timing. A great baseball batter will be able to coordinate, loading their weight onto the back foot, taking a stride into the swing, making sure the hips rotate at the right time, so everything's coming together at the point of contact. The key isn't simply to be able to have all those elements and execute them well. It's to have all the elements of the swing and bring them together in one perfect swing, to do everything at the right time. And timing, as I've said, is important in our readings. St. Paul says in our epistle from Romans that while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. And timing is even more central to that Old Testament story we heard of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah was the wife of Abraham, whom we heard last week God called to leave his home and travel to a new land. This call came when they were both quite old. Even in La Jolla years, they were quite old. Well beyond the child-rearing age. Yet these 3 mysterious visitors come to Abraham with the news that at the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah will have a son. This was a message that Sarah found laughable. But when it turned out to be true, Sarah realized that God's timing is not the same as our timing. There's a great passage that begins in the book of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. God has a time for everything because his timing is perfect. But the problem is that we have our own view of when things should happen, which doesn't always coincide with God's perfect timing. We need to learn to be patient, to trust in God's timing. As the psalmist says, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. There's a great verse in our epistle. St. Paul writes, we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. I think baseball is a game that produces character because it's a game based on suffering and failure. A team can lose 70 games in a season. It's still a success. Even a great batter only hits the ball 2 or 3 times out of 10 pitches. Which is why they say, what do you call a baseball player who's constantly failed for 70% of the time for 20 years? A Hall of Famer. Like the great baseball players, God's people need to be persistent and persevere in faith as we wait on God, as we wait for His timing to be revealed. We have to learn to trust in God's timing and continue to step out in faith. Or as Babe Ruth said, we can't let the fear of striking out keep us from swinging. Of course, that might lead to failure, but we can't reach second base with a foot on first. Abby was speaking last week about stepping out in faith, taking a step or a leap of faith. And I was reminded of the story we have in the Gospels of St. Peter in the boat. You remember the story, the disciples were out fishing and they saw Jesus walk by on the water. And Jesus invited Peter to join him. Being the bold disciple that he was, he stepped out of the boat. It wasn't long before he sank, but he took the first step. And as they say, if you want to walk on water, you've got to step out of the boat. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And St. Paul goes on, hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts. The Christian hope that Paul is describing here is not the same as the hope that a Padres fan, that this will be the year that the Padres win the World Series. I fear that's closer to wishful thinking. Christian hope is founded on the reality that God and His love for each one of us, that's the basis. That's the ground on which we have a solid Christian hope, God's love for each one of us. Paul writes, hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts. And he goes on, God proved His love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The object of our hope matters. We hope in a God in whom we can trust, a God who has proved His love for us. Finally, I couldn't help but read today's gospel reading as an image of Jesus as a coach, gathering his team into a huddle before sending them out onto the field. The harvest is plentiful, Jesus says, but the labourers are few. In other Gospels, he sends them out in pairs, which our Gospel that we heard today doesn't, which is a shame, because I would have quoted Yogi Berra, who once said to his team, pair up in threes. Jesus summoned the 12 and sent them out with clear instructions. And look at who he was talking to. Peter, who denied knowing him. Matthew, who was a reviled tax collector. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. This was not an all-star team. They were deeply flawed. But yet each of them had a vital role to play in the team that Jesus selected. And we too, we know, are flawed disciples. And yet we too have a role to play in the building of God's kingdom. Every coach relies on their players because they can't do it themselves. They have to give clear instruction to the team. As St. Teresa of Avila said, Christ has no hands but our hands, no feet but our feet. We are part of the team that Jesus sends out and equips to do his work in the world. And let us be bold and fearless members of that team.